In recent decades, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, better known as ASEAN, has faced many criticisms regarding its inefficient responses to. ASEAN was built on the promise of unity and collective strength, yet today it's under fire for failing to act decisively when it matters most, from escalating territorial disputes in the South China Sea to economic spats and trade wars to a humanitarian crisis in Myanmar. ASEAN's much-touted centrality is being put to the test. In this video, we'll explore how and why ASEAN has struggled to present a unified front in the face of these major geopolitical crises and what that means for the bloc's future relevance. Before diving into the crises, let's set the stage with a bit of history. ASEAN was formed in 1967 by 5 countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, at a time when the Cold War and regional conflicts loomed large. Its founding goals were simple yet ambitious: to promote peace, prevent conflicts between neighbors, and foster cooperation so Southeast Asian nations could stand on their own feet. The ASEAN Way emerged, a style of decision-making based on consultation, consensus, and non-interference in each other's internal affairs. This approach helped turn former rivals into partners and prevented open wars among ASEAN members for decades. It also gave birth to the principle of ASEAN centrality, the idea that ASEAN should be the central platform for addressing regional issues and engaging major powers. ASEAN's 2007 charter explicitly enshrined maintaining ASEAN centrality as a core principle, tasking the group to be the primary driving force in regional cooperation and diplomacy. However, lofty principles on paper don't always match reality. ASEAN centrality was supposed to mean that when challenges arise in Southeast Asia, ASEAN speaks with one voice and leads the response. But in practice, unity has been hard to come by. The bloc's consensus rule means any one member's objection can stall action, often resulting in bland statements or no response at the diplomat.com. As we'll see, when each member pursues its own national agenda, prioritizing immediate interests over regional solidarity, ASEAN's collective strength crumbles. Let's examine 3 pressing crises that have laid bare the cracks in ASEAN's unity. 1. The South China Sea disputes. 2. Dealing with trade and economic tensions. And 3. The post-coup chaos in Myanmar. To understand ASEAN's current failures, we need to recall why ASEAN was founded. The bloc was born out of a desire for stability. In the 1960s, Southeast Asia was a tinderbox of rivalry and ideological conflict. By coming together, the original members aimed to avoid war with each other and stand united against outside interference. Early on, this worked. ASEAN became a platform for regional reconciliation, ensuring disputes didn't spiral into open conflict. The ASEAN way of quiet diplomacy and consensus was credited with geopolitical miracles, turning battlefields into bargaining tables and hostility into cooperation. In the decades that followed, ASEAN expanded to include all 10 Southeast Asian countries, with Timor-Leste now on track to join. It also became more ambitious. By the 1990s and 2000s, ASEAN established itself as the convener of Asia-Pacific dialogues, forming the ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, and other ASEAN-centric forums. This was ASEAN centrality in action. The notion that ASEAN is in the driver's seat of regional affairs, providing a neutral ground where great powers like the US, China, and others must engage on ASEAN's terms. For a while, this strategy paid off. ASEAN's neutral convening power mitigated mistrust among major powers and promoted norms of peaceful dialogue. It also laid the foundation for economic cooperation, such as the ASEAN Free Trade Area, and joint responses to crises, including the 1997 Asian financial meltdown. Yet, as ASEAN's role grew with the growing expectations over time, cracks began to show. The diversity within ASEAN in political systems, economic levels, and foreign alignment made true unity difficult. Consensus decision-making, once a source of harmony, increasingly led to lowest common denominator outcomes, especially on contentious issues. Observers started asking tough questions. Can ASEAN's principle of non-interference handle a member state's domestic crisis that threatens regional stability? Can consensus diplomacy stand firm when external powers apply pressure? These questions have come to the fore in recent years as we turn to our first major crisis, the South China Sea. Few challenges test ASEAN unity more than the South China Sea disputes. This is a tangle of territorial claims where several ASEAN countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, with its Natuna Sea, find themselves at odds with an blow-up bio as with an increasingly assertive China. Beijing claims the vast majority of the South China Sea through its infamous 9-dash line, overlapping with the exclusive economic zones of ASEAN coastal states. Over the past decade, China has built artificial islands, deployed ships and aircraft, and pressed its claim with growing confidence, turning the strategic waterway into a geopolitical flashpoint. You might expect ASEAN to rally together when faced with such a challenge to its members' sovereignty. Instead, the opposite happened. On the South China Sea issue, ASEAN has often been paralyzed by internal divisions. A dramatic example came in 2012 at the ASEAN foreign ministers' meeting that year. The members could not even agree on a joint communiqué, the first time in ASEAN's history that a summit ended without a unified statement. Why? Because Cambodia, which held ASEAN's chair at the time, and was a close partner of China, refused to allow any mention of the South China Sea disputes in the communiqué. Phnom Penh's stance, seen as appeasing Beijing, collided with the interests of Vietnam and the Philippines, who wanted ASEAN to address China's actions. The result was a deadlock and diplomatic embarrassment. The family of Southeast Asian nations couldn't present a common front even in the face of clear threats to some of its members' territories. This wasn't an isolated incident. In 2016, when an international tribunal ruled in favor of the Philippines and against China's expansive claims, ASEAN's response was muted, again watered down by those members aligned with Beijing the diplomat. The Philippines itself, under President Duterte at the time, chose to sideline the ruling at ASEAN forums after heavy lobbying from China, prioritizing bilateral ties with Beijing over rallying ASEAN support. Meanwhile, countries like Cambodia and Laos, major recipients of Chinese investment and aid, have consistently blocked or weakened ASEAN statements critical of China's behavior in the South China Sea. It's an open secret that some ASEAN members have essentially taken China's side, or at least decided not to antagonize Beijing in exchange for economic benefits. This divide-and-conquer dynamic has severely undermined ASEAN's ability to deal with the South China Sea as a bloc. The consequences are stark. Without ASEAN unity, claimants like Vietnam or the Philippines are left to fend for themselves. That changing steel process and single process, or the Philippines are left to fend for themselves, while China prefers to deal one-on-one where its power advantage is greatest. Beijing has been quick to exploit these rifts, offering lucrative investments or loan to pliant governments and picking off dissenters one by one. As a result, negotiations for a meaningful code of conduct in the South China Sea have dragged on interminably with little progress. ASEAN's consensus norm, meant to build unity, instead became a tool that Beijing can manipulate. Any single member's dissent, often influenced by Chinese pressure or promises, can veto a tough ASEAN. This has led even outside observers to question ASEAN's relevance. The United States, for example, has urged the ASEAN claimants to first resolve their differences with each other so they can collectively push back against China. In other words, if ASEAN can't get its act together internally, its voice on the world stage will remain weak. The South China Sea saga shows how diverging national interests, some prioritizing Chinese ties, others defending their territory, have torn ASEAN's unity apart. It's a classic case of the whole being less than the sum of its parts. ASEAN's famed centrality has been absent in one of the region's most urgent security disputes, and this failure has emboldened China to press on. As one analysis bluntly put it, ASEAN's approach so far has failed to demonstrate ASEAN centrality to be anything more than a political talking point in the South China Sea. Shifting from security to economics, ASEAN also struggles to speak with one voice on trade. In finance, even though prosperity was supposed to be a unifying goal, the 10 ASEAN economies form a diverse bunch. We have advanced, open economies like Singapore on one end and more closed, developing markets on the other. ASEAN launched an ASEAN Free Trade Area, ATA, in the 1990s, and later the ASEAN Economic Community, aiming for seamless intra-regional trade. On paper, tariffs within ASEAN have largely been eliminated over the years, but integration remains shallow in many ways. Intra-ASEAN trade still makes up only about 22% of ASEAN's total trade as of 2023, a figure that hasn't improved for a decade. This is low compared to, say, the European Union's internal trade, and it hints at something important. ASEAN economies are still looking outward, to China, the US, Europe, more than they trade with each other. They also often compete with each other for investments and export markets rather than act as one unit. This competition can turn into tension. Member states sometimes undercut each other with beggar-thy-neighbor policies, like competing tax or debt to you life, brakes to lure foreign factories, or restrictions on exports to protect their industries at neighbors' expense. And when global trade disputes erupt, ASEAN has a hard time formulating a united response. A recent example came with the trade wars and tariff battles of the past few years. When the U.S.-China trade war hit in 2018-2019, some ASEAN countries, like Vietnam, benefited from factories relocating out of China, while others, like Malaysia or Thailand, worried about collateral damage to their export-dependent industries. Each country scrambled to adapt individually. By 2025, as trade protectionism continued to rise, the United States imposed sweeping tariffs on a range of ASEAN exports, citing trade imbalances. The tariffs were not uniform. Some countries, like Cambodia and Vietnam, were hit with nearly 50% duties on certain goods, while others, like Singapore, faced lower rates. This could have been a rallying moment for ASEAN to band together and push back as a bloc. Instead, initial responses were all over the map. Some countries rushed into bilateral talks with Washington, others stayed relatively quiet, and a few sought to use the crisis to gain a competitive edge. Only after some time did ASEAN start discussing a coordinated strategy under Malaysia's 2025 chairmanship to navigate these tariffs, including possibly engaging the U.S. as a group and boosting intra-ASEAN trade to rely less on the U.S. market. It was a telling scenario. ASEAN's first instinct was not unified action, but a scramble of individual state agendas. Each member calculated its stake: who could negotiate a better deal, who could afford to retaliate people that they related to which you as a sake for to retaliate, or not, making a mockery of the idea that ASEAN always acts as one. Beyond the U.S. tariffs, consider other trade challenges. External pressures like the European Tenbull Union's environmental regulations on palm oil, which set Malaysia and Indonesia on a diplomatic offensive largely outside an ASEAN framework, or internal rifts over market access, for instance Thailand and Vietnam occasionally spar over agricultural trade, or Indonesia's restrictions on commodity exports irritating neighbors. These all underscore how national economic interests often trump regional solidarity. Yes, ASEAN has collective trade agreements including the huge Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, with external partners, but when hard decisions arrive, unity often breaks down. As one observer noted, ASEAN countries' economic and geopolitical diversity will hinder significant progress toward deeper integration, despite official statements to the contrary. In simple terms, the richer and more industrialized members have different priorities than the poorer and more agrarian ones. Some rely on Chinese markets, others on American technology or Japanese investment. Achieving a common stance means somebody has to sacrifice a short-term interest for the greater good, and that's a tough sell politically. The result is a kind of paralysis on big issues in trade as well. ASEAN statements frequently end up reaffirming bland commitments to free trade and open economies, but avoid any concrete collective action that might require one member to compromise. For a general audience, the takeaway is this: even though ASEAN markets combined form a powerhouse, the fifth largest economy in the world as a bloc, they haven't fully harnessed that collective clout. The relentless pursuit of individual gain, every nation for itself, means ASEAN punches below its weight. These economic divisions, if left unresolved, threaten ASEAN's credibility as a unified trading bloc and undermine the notion that centrality can protect Southeast Asia's interests in a turbulent global economy. Perhaps no regional issue has tested ASEAN's principles and exposed its fault lines as starkly as the crisis in Myanmar. In February 2021, Myanmar's military seized power in a coup, toppling the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. The country descended into chaos. Millions protested. The junta responded with brutal force. Conflicts flared across Myanmar's regions, and a humanitarian disaster unfolded with thousands detained or killed. This was not just a domestic issue, it threatened regional stability, with refugees spilling over borders and a risk of civil war in ASEAN's backyard. ASEAN faced a dilemma. Traditionally, it follows non-interference, not meddling in members' internal affairs. But the Myanmar coup was too grave to ignore, as it also produces regional challenges like, in an unprecedented move, ASEAN leaders held an emergency meeting in April 2021 and agreed on a plan known as the 5-point consensus to address the Myanmar crisis. The 5 points included an immediate end to violence, dialogue among all parties in Myanmar, appointment of an ASEAN special envoy to mediate, delivery of humanitarian aid, and a visit by the envoy to meet all stakeholders. This consensus was hailed as a breakthrough at the time, a sign that ASEAN could take action on a pressing regional issue. But what followed turned that initial hope into a harsh lesson on ASEAN's disunity. Over 2 years later, the 5-point consensus lies in tatters. The Myanmar junta simply ignored its commitments, continuing and even escalating violence despite agreeing to stop, and flatly refusing to cooperate with ASEAN's envoy. More disappointing, however, was ASEAN's inability to enforce its plan. Divisions among member states soon emerged. Some governments, notably Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, grew outspoken and openly criticized Myanmar's generals for flouting the agreement and calling for tougher action. They pushed for Myanmar to be barred from high-level ASEAN meetings, essentially isolating the junta diplomatically until it complied. Indeed, ASEAN did take the symbolic step of excluding Myanmar's military leaders from summits and allowing only a non-political representative to attend. This was a bold move for a bloc that usually prides itself on inclusion. However, other ASEAN members took a softer line. Cambodia, for instance, when it held the ASEAN chair in 2022, engaged the junta more directly, even sending its prime minister for a visit to Myanmar and embracing dialogue with the military rulers. Thailand, sharing a long border to the obvious people, and concerned about stability next door, initiated its quiet talks with the junta outside of the official ASEAN framework. These moves frustrated the more hardline countries. The resulting split was palpable. While Malaysia and Singapore refused to legitimize the junta, Cambodia and Thailand appeared willing to deal with it in hopes of gradual progress. Vietnam and Laos, with their own Communist Party rule or strategic interests, stayed relatively quiet or supported a cautious approach. In short, ASEAN countries could not agree on how to handle one of their own members in crisis. This disunity has rendered ASEAN largely ineffective in Myanmar. The 5-point consensus, as Human Rights Watch put it a year later, proved to be hollow. ASEAN failed to fulfill its pledges or press the junta to change course. Violence in Myanmar continued unabated, with thousands killed and displaced, while ASEAN's envoy was blocked from even meeting key figures like Aung San Suu Kyi. The junta's blatant defiance exposed ASEAN's weakness for all to see. It also exposed fractures within ASEAN itself, a family divided over whether to punish or engage a wayward member. In fact, by 2023, there were essentially two tracks: one group of ASEAN states still trying to enforce the consensus and isolate the junta, and another group holding separate dialogues with the junta to nudge it along or secure their own bilateral interests. Imagine a football team where half the players refuse to take the field while the other half are playing a different game entirely. That's how disjointed ASEAN's Myanmar strategy became. For the people of Myanmar, ASEAN's paralysis has been devastating, offering little relief. For ASEAN's reputation, it's been equally damaging. The Myanmar crisis highlighted that when national interests diverge, whether due to border letters projects and the Mom interests diverge, security concerns, geopolitical alignment, or principles of sovereignty, ASEAN's vaunted norms can crumble. Non-interference became an excuse for inaction for some states, while others felt compelled to break that tradition out of moral responsibility, leading to a rare public split. In the end, nobody was on the same page. The Myanmar fiasco thus stands as a stark warning. If ASEAN cannot jointly address turmoil within its region, its claims of centrality and credibility suffer gravely. So what do these failures mean for ASEAN's future? The South China Sea standoff, the fragmented response to trade challenges, and the Myanmar crisis all tell a similar story, a story of a bloc hamstrung by diverging bays of national interests. In each case, short-term calculations by individual member states chipped away at collective action. ASEAN's consensus model, meant to forge unity, instead gave each nation a de facto veto, which they often use to shield their agenda or please an outside power. Over time, this has bred cynicism about ASEAN's effectiveness. Surveys show that a growing number of Southeast Asians view ASEAN as slow, ineffective, and increasingly disunited, even becoming irrelevant in a changing world. That is a harsh verdict for an organization that prides itself on centrality and unity. Internationally, ASEAN's faltering unity risks eroding its credibility as the central platform for regional affairs. Major powers have noticed ASEAN's inability to tackle big issues decisively. This has paved the way for new groupings and interventions that bypass ASEAN. The emergence of security arrangements like the Quad, involving the US, Japan, India, Australia, or AUKUS, is partly a response to the sense that ASEAN isn't up to the task of dealing with pressing strategic threats. If ASEAN cannot maintain a cohesive front, external powers will simply make their plans with or without ASEAN. We've already seen hints of this, calls for minilateral meetings among only the willing Southeast Asian countries or superpowers directly mediating in disputes that ASEAN could not resolve. Each such instance chips away at the notion of ASEAN centrality.